At the public premiere of the 4th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen, Dallas Jenkins stated that it was the most difficult and complicated episode of The Chosen to film, and it is undeniable that this assessment is accurate. In this episode, Simon the Zealot, a future disciple, and the invalid at the pool of Bethesda, who, in The Chosen, is the brother of Simon the Zealot, are introduced to us. This is our first extended excursion to Jerusalem, and it is also the first time that we have been to Jerusalem. This Miracle of the Week tale is one of the most meticulously designed episodes of The Chosen to date, despite the fact that the tension among the disciples and their quest to come together briefly takes a back seat to the storyline. Furthermore, in addition to being a story that is fascinating, the 4th episode of The Chosen Season 2 includes a number of interesting ideas that will be worth examining with your youth group. Intro questions for the 1st episode of The Chosen Season, to Episode 4, The Man at Bethesda Pool. Before you begin your time together, have your young people read the primary passage that is being adapted for this episode of The Chosen. In the aftermath of this, there was a celebration for the Jewish people, and Jesus traveled to Jerusalem. Now, there is a pool in Jerusalem that is known as Bethesda in Aramaic. It is located by the Sheep Gate, and it features 5 colonnades that are covered with roofs. These contained a large number of disabled people, including those who were blind, lame, and paralyzed. It was there that there was a man who had been a disabled person for 38 years. In response to the fact that Jesus observed him lying there and was aware that he had been there for a considerable amount of time, he asked him, "Do you want to be healed?" Jesus told the sick man, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." The sick man responded to him by saying, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going another steps down before me." Jesus again said, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." The man was immediately healed, and he walked in his bed. It was the Sabbath on that particular day. The Jews responded to the man who had been healed by saying, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." However, the man responded by saying, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They then asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" The guy who had been healed was now unable to identify the person who had healed him, because Jesus had departed from the area because there was a large throng present. John 5:1-13. English Standard Version. Give your youth group an explanation of. During the time period of the New Testament, it was customary for people to believe that particular locations, such as the Pool of Bethesda, possessed the miraculous power to bring about healing. Some Jewish people may have believed that this was due to the fact that God had blessed these locations, while others may have claimed that these healing spots were tied to pagan gods such as Asclepius. The Pool of Bethesda was only known to heal individuals at a particular moment, which was when the waters had been stirred up. This was a precise time. There is most likely that there was a hot spring located underground. Only the first person to approach the waters that were stirring was able to receive healing. People who were afflicted with incapacitating illnesses, injuries, or birth deformities would frequently assemble around miraculous locations such as Bethesda, in the expectation that their illnesses would be cured. It's possible that some of them have family members who help them move back and forth from their homes and provide assistance when they need it, but others were practically homeless people who had to beg in order to acquire assistance and food. Next, inquire of your students. If you were a person who waited around pools like Bethesda in the hopes of having a sickness or disability healed, what do you think it would have been like to be in that situation? What kinds of feelings do you think you would experience? Jesus sees the ill lying by the pool of Bethesda and asks him, "Do you want to be healed?" What would you say if someone asked you that question after you had been crippled for almost 40 years? How would you respond to that question? How do you think Jesus came up with the idea to ask him that question? Do you have any idea what he meant by that? Observe that the man did not provide a direct response to the question that Jesus posed. He does not state whether he wants to get well or not, but rather, he gives the reason why he believes he is unable to become well. He says that he does not have anyone who can throw him in the pool, when it has churned it up. Afterward, Jesus only instructs him to stand up and walk, and he is immediately healed. In what way do you believe we are intended to draw a conclusion? You should explain that this episode of The Chosen Season 2 will be examining many of these questions in an innovative manner, filling in the specifics that the Bible left us wondering about. Questions for review. Those that have been selected. Up to this point. It is a good idea to frequently review some relevant information from past episodes of The Chosen, especially considering that there is not a regular previously on The Chosen segment. This is because the storyline of The Chosen has become more complicated at the beginning of the second season. There are a few questions that you might wish to go over again. It is not necessary to take too much time. This is simply a brief review. Who exactly are the disciples who have been following Jesus up to this point? In the second episode of the second season of The Chosen, Jesus came across a guy who was experiencing the collapse of his career all around him. Is he a person? What actions did he take? Which disciples appear to have the capacity to take the leadership role within the body? In the sixth episode of the first season of The Chosen, Jesus encountered opposition from a Pharisee in the city of Capernaum. Are you able to recall his initials? Where did he get his anger from? Watching the fourth episode of the second season of The Chosen. Despite the fact that The Chosen Season 2, Episode 4 was broadcast live on YouTube and Facebook, new episodes are now only allowed to remain online for a period of 24 hours before being automatically removed. You will need to download the Chosen app, available on Google Play and Apple App Store, in order to watch this season with your group. In the course of watching the fourth episode of the second season of The Chosen, I occasionally give comments through the chat, but I make an effort to avoid doing too much lecturing. It is my hope that young people will take pleasure in it and not only view The Chosen as an elaborate instance of preaching. The most of the time, I simply define who the characters are, and then every once in a while, I provide a brief explanation of a reference or allusion that is unclear to my younger self. Simon and Jesse are the topics of discussion for the fourth episode of The Chosen Season 2. Your youth group should begin by asking the following questions. What was it about this episode that stood out to you the most? Did you find any of the scenes to be particularly intriguing or emotionally moving? Can you tell me if you have any inquiries regarding what took place? Did the cure of the ill man at the pool of Bethesda turn out according to what you had anticipated it would? Make sure your kids understand. In order to provide an explanation for why the invalid tells Jesus in the Gospel of John that he does not have someone to put him in the water, this episode of The Chosen portrayed him as having a sibling who left him in order to pursue a life as a Jewish zealot. It is important to keep in mind that the land of Israel was occupied by the Roman Empire throughout the period of the New Testament. This was after the Roman Empire had conquered the land some decades earlier. Throughout the course of The Chosen, we have been shown that the Romans were despised by the majority of the Jewish people because they were perceived as tyrannical adversaries. The Zealots were a group of Jews who held the belief that God had commanded them to use physical force in order to topple the Roman Empire. Certain members of this group of Zealots, who were referred to as Sicari, were responsible for carrying out terrorist assaults and murders against Romans and Jews who collaborated with the Roman Empire. Simon was a zealot, and Jesus was actually acquainted with him. He is listed as one of the 12 disciples in each of the Gospels, despite the fact that the Gospels tell us absolutely little about him. This particular element does not originate from the Gospels, despite the fact that The Chosen portrays Simon the Zealot as the brother of Jesse, the invalid whom Jesus heals by the pool of Bethesda. In order to convey a point, The Chosen uses a number of inventive connections between these two characters. Now, inquire of your younger generation. What gave you the impression that The Chosen chose to make Jesse, the invalid brother, and Simon the Zealot brother? When you learned that Jesse had a brother who abandoned him at the pool in order to go fight the Roman Empire, how does this information impact your perception of Jesse specifically? What kind of impact does it have on your perception of Simon the Zealot, knowing that he left his brother helplessly languishing by the pool of Bethesda while he went out to become a zealot and battle for the liberation of the Jews? What is it that Simon the Zealot has placed his faith in to bring about salvation? Jesse the invalid has placed his faith in something that will bring him salvation. What are the outcomes of the hopes that Simon and Jesse have? At first, Jesse is hopeful that the pool of Bethesda would be able to save him from his wounds, but he ultimately comes to regret his decision. As an alternative to the pool, what does he find out is a significantly more promising possibility? In the event that Simon the Zealot had been successful in carrying out his plan to kill the Roman leader, his hopes would have been dashed by the intervention of Atticus, the Roman spy who was working covertly. After witnessing Jesus heal his brother, do you believe that he will continue to trust that he can bring salvation through violent means? What are some examples of the kinds of things that people place their hope in today? In what ways do these hopes ultimately fail to live up to our expectations? What do you think it would be like if we stopped investing our hope in things that make us feel disappointed, such as the pool of Bethesda, and instead centered our hopes on Jesus? In order to give your students a sneak peek into the future, please explain. It is possible that you have observed that Shemuel, the Pharisee who opposed Jesus in the first season of The Chosen, has returned, and he is accompanied by a new gang of Pharisees. A number of these Pharisees were there during the healing of Jesse and saw how Jesus instructed him to get up, take his mat, and walk during the process, due to the fact that it was banned to carry a mat around on the Sabbath. We may anticipate that their disagreement with Jesus regarding this matter will be introduced in the following episode of The Chosen Season 2. Commentary on the 4th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen. For what reason does this episode leave out John 5:14-15? While the 4th episode of The Chosen Season 2 concludes on a positive note, with Jesse gleefully dancing on his new legs and expressing his appreciation to Jesus, the original account of this narrative in the Gospel of John concludes in a far more conflicted manner. The Jews responded to the man who had been healed by saying, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." However, the man responded by saying, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They then asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" The guy who had been healed was now unable to identify the person who had healed him because Jesus had departed from the area because there was a large throng present. Following that, Jesus discovered him in the temple and addressed him, saying, "See, you are doing well." The man walked out and informed the Jews that Jesus was the one who had healed him. He said, "From this day forward, you will not sin again, and nothing worse will happen to you." The Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was engaging in these activities on the Sabbath, and this was the reason why they were doing so. Exegesis of John 5:10-16. The conclusion of this tale in the Gospel of John seems to imply that the invalid, after being healed by Jesus, becomes a snitch and reports Jesus to the Pharisees. This is the conclusion that is given. In addition, the sketchiness of the invalid is brought out by the fact that his healing in John 5 is precisely paralleled by the healing of the man born blind in John 9, as well as the far more faithful reaction of the blind man. In the 4th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen, we do not see any indications that Jesse is responding to his healing in a questionable manner. It is feasible that this can be explained in 2 different ways. The very first reason is that we have not yet arrived at that particular stage in the narrative. This would be very consistent with the Gospel of John, which is extremely interested in the way that people initially respond to Jesus with trust when he performs a miracle, but later lose faith in him when he does not perform something that cannot be explained, or when the water becomes too hot. There is also the possibility that the show intended this story to have a happy ending, and as a result, it made considerable changes to the story in order to bring it to the desired conclusion. To tell you the truth, I wouldn't be surprised if the second explanation turns out to be correct. Nonetheless, I would prefer the first explanation because there are a lot of other miraculous healings that the program could have exploited, instead of weakening a significant aspect of this particular story. On the other hand, considering that this is an adaptation, which implies that it is their telling of these events, I won't be too upset if they have modified this rather small story. Could there have been a brother named Jesse who was Simon the Zealot? Is it possible that Simon the Zealot had a brother who was unable to move? According to the Bible, there is no evidence to suggest that Simon the Zealot was related to the man who was crippled at the Pool of Bethesda incident. With regard to Simon the Zealot, the Bible provides us with very little information, and it does not provide any information about his family. During the 4th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen, Simon the Zealot is shown to be the brother of Jesse, the paralyzed man whom Jesus heals at the Pool of Bethesda. Jesse is the name given to the character in the show. For the sake of giving Simon's persona more depth and implying that there are thematic parallels between their respective experiences, the connection between the two individuals is a fabrication. At the Pool of Bethesda, who was the identity of the man? Few details about the man whom Jesus healed at the Pool of Bethesda are provided to us by the Bible. These include the following. A1. He went to the pool in the hopes of being healed by the power that was said to be that pool. 2. When he was finally able to recover from his paralysis, he had been unable to move for 38 years. He is not identified by name in the Bible, nor is there any reference of anyone else to whom he was related. The man who is seen by the pool in The Chosen is referred to as Jesse, and he is portrayed as the brother of Simon the Zealot. For further information, see the section above. What was the nature of the encounter between Jesus and Simon the Zealot? No account of how Simon the Zealot came to know Jesus can be found in the Bible. By the time that the Gospels make reference to Simon, for example, in Matthew 10:1-4, it would appear that he had already established himself as John the Baptist's disciple. During the 4th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen, Simon the Zealot becomes reunited with his brother, Jesse, after they had been apart for a number of years. Upon further investigation, he finds out that Jesus has healed Jesse. In the 5th episode of the 2nd season, Simon goes in search of Jesus and joins the disciples. Before he came into contact with Jesus, what did Simon the Zealot do? There is no information on Simon the Zealot that can be found in the Bible prior to his encounter with Jesus. On the other hand, the fact that he was known as the Zealot gives the impression that he most likely belonged to a group of aggressive Jewish rebels. Simon is shown in The Chosen as a zealot, who gives up his violent ways in order to join Jesus. This viewpoint is supported by the film. Who is Atticus according to the Bible? It has not been discovered that there are any prominent figures in the Bible that are comparable to Atticus Emilius. It is quite probable that he is a character that was fabricated by The Chosen in order to facilitate the progression of the plot and carry out deeds that we are aware must have taken place, but which are not documented in exhaustive detail in the Bible. At the Pool of Bethesda, who was the angel that appeared? The King James Version of the Bible includes the following sentence in its depiction of the Pool of Bethesda. The reason for this is that during a particular time of year, an angel descended into the pool and caused the water to become troubled. Consequently, whoever entered the pool first, after the water became troubled, was healed of any illness that he had. John 5:4, King James Version. That this verse is not included in the main text of the majority of current translations is something that readers of those translations will notice. Nonetheless, it is frequently located in the footnotes of such translations. This is due to the fact that this particular sentence fails to appear in the earliest Greek copies of the section, and the majority of experts are of the opinion that it was not included in the original Gospel of John. It is possible that the scribe who was copying the passage added this statement in order to clarify the reason why the waters brought healing, as it was a question that was puzzling to readers during his day. There is a possibility that the Pool of Bethesda was associated with a pagan group. Hence, it is also plausible that he was attempting to conceal those associations. We have no other information on the angel who was depicted, if he really existed at all. This is true regardless of the reason that this line was inserted. In the 3rd episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, titled Last Supper, Part 2, what took place? In this particular episode, it is impossible to differentiate between the various tales that are being told. The disputes that Jesus had with the religious leaders, the debates that took place among the disciples, and the conversations that he had with Peter, James, John, and Andrew will all be consolidated into a single narrative. Kaphne's tale is the only other one that I will highlight separately, a cold opening for the Last Supper. Once more, we are presented with a cold open drawn from the Last Supper. In this passage, Jesus cautions his followers that he is going to a location that they are unable to follow, but he also tells them to not be disturbed because he is making a place in the house of his Father for them. John 13:33 to 14:3. The disciples have a hard time understanding what he is trying to say. Thomas asks, how can they know the way if they don't know where he is going? John 14:5, which is the verse that prompted Jesus to say, I am the way and the truth and the life. In John 14:6, it is written that no one comes to the Father except through me. During the time that Philip is asking Jesus to demonstrate the Father, Jesus asks them how they have been with him for such a long time, and they have not seen the Father in him. John 14:8 to 11. Jesus responds to Matthew's question about how they will know what to do without him by stating that he is going to send a new helper, the Holy Spirit, to dwell within them. John 14:15, 17. Despite the fact that Nathanael and Big James are not thrilled with the prospect of receiving a new assistant, Jesus argues that he will remind them of what he has taught them and assist them in comprehending it. John 14:18, 26. In spite of the fact that the past week has been somewhat upsetting, Jesus assures them that he will bring them peace and gives them encouragement by letting them know that he is going to the Father, urging them to believe. John 14:27 through 29. At this point, Peter asserts that his lack of faith is not an issue for him, and he says that he would give his life for Jesus. Returning to the episode before this one. In the third episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, Jesus, the disciples, and the religious leaders are shown. In the third episode, we start up where we left off in the second episode, with Jesus addressing Caiaphas and the Pharisees in the courts of Parliament. As Roman soldiers approach Jesus with the intention of arresting him, Atticus gives them orders to remain in place and invites Jesus to make his point before continuing. When Jesus confronts the leaders of the religious establishment, he makes a comment on how God has said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but they have turned it into a den of thieves." Mark 11:17. Despite the fact that Passover is about to take place, Jesus stresses that there will be no more sacrifices of animals that have been purchased because of their dishonest manners. Zeal for your house will consume me. It is written in the Bible, according to Simon Zede, who is listening to Jesus speak. This passage can be found in John 2:17 and Psalm 69:9. Jesus firmly affirms that the authority he is functioning under is his own when the leaders dispute the authority by which he is acting. And as a sign, he challenges them to destroy this temple and pledges to restore it in 3 days. This is a cryptic message that they find difficult to understand, considering that it took 46 years to construct the temple, John 2:18 to 21. Upon witnessing the defeat of the religious leaders, the multitude was led by children who proclaimed, "Hosanna to the Son of David," which is found in Matthew 21:15. When the religious authorities went back inside, Shmuel insisted that they record Jesus' threat to destroy the temple in great detail. See Mark 14:58. However, the other officials questioned whether or not it was more of a prediction than a threat. Regardless, they are all of the opinion that Jesus has committed blasphemy, with the exception of Yusuf, whom Shmuel reprimands for his belief. On the other hand, they are aware that Jesus has the support of the people. Due to the fact that he appears to be truthful, they intend to trick him by asking him challenging questions in order to reveal him to the crowds as a fraud. Following Jesus and the disciples' departure from the temple, Judas and the disciples engage in a discussion amongst themselves over the manner in which people will mark Passover in the event that there are no more sacrifices to be brought into the temple. Peter strongly encourages them to let Jesus depart, despite the fact that they do not want him to leave once more. Simon Z is concerned that the Pharisees are making an effort to locate him, but Jesus makes a threatening suggestion that they could be successful. This makes Z even more anxious to follow, despite the fact that he does not understand what Jesus is saying. Yet James encourages him to remain with the group. As John returns to Phoebe's house, he inquires of Thaddeus whether or not he has ever witnessed Jesus in such a manner before. In spite of the fact that Thomas is still resentful of the violence that Jesus caused and how it affected Ramah, none of them have witnessed Jesus engaging in aggressive behavior. Although Philip explains that the attack on the sacrificial system is actually an attack on a distorted version of their sacrificial system, Judas is troubled by the fact that it is being carried out. But Judas is anxious about how they are meant to defend Jesus, and he has to stress right now that he wants to protect Jesus, but he is worried that he is missing an opportunity to bring their people together. Mary, who is experiencing difficulties, leaves, explaining to Andrew that she needs to get assistance. While the disciple continues to speak, Andrew ponders what it would be like to observe things from a different perspective than that of the disciple. Nathanael makes the observation that if he were a person in the marketplace, he would conclude that Jesus was having a difficult day. However, the other individuals point out that the people started chanting just as Jesus was leaving. During the time that the disciples are conversing, Matthew expresses his gratitude to Jesus for allowing him to assist with the Sermon on the Mount. While Jesus is pondering whether or not it would be more beneficial to leave the others, he extends an invitation to him to go hear him preach. He is aware that the occurrences that have occurred over the course of this week have been unexpected and perhaps alarming for them. Matthew likes surprises since they provide opportunities for more profound learning and comprehension, but he is afraid of genuine shocks. However, Jesus encourages Matthew to continue listening and observing as he always has. Jesus explains that they will no longer have any more opportunities for one-on-one teachings, which is a really disappointing news. As the other disciples come into view, Jesus discloses to them, much to their delight, that he is going to go teach the parable of the vineyard. Jesus begins his teaching in the temple by telling the parable of the talents. Matthew 25:14-30. As the masses observe, some of the people who are present include Yusuf, who is disguised, the watcher who is being watched by Simon Z, Shula, and Barnaby. Because Shmuel and the religious leaders have questions that they want him to answer in front of everyone, they interrupt him. They want him to answer these questions so that he can reveal his identity to the people. In the first place, Zebediah concerns himself with the origin of Jesus' authority. In answer, Jesus confronts John with the question of where John's authority originates. As the Pharisees come to the realization that he has ensnared them, they gather together in a huddle. They must either admit that John was correct and they were incorrect, or they must anger the multitude by contradicting John. In response to the counsel of Shmuel, they assert that they are ignorant, and as a result, Jesus declines to respond to their inquiry. Matthew 21:23-27. Jesus proceeds to relate the parable of the vineyard, Matthew 21:33-41, while the disciples act out the story on the steps of the temple. He does this in order to capitalize on the favorable circumstances. At first, Shmuel and his friends don't understand that the parable is about them and the temple, but eventually Jesus explains that the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Matthew 21:42, Psalm 118:22-23, and that the kingdom is being taken from them and given to those who bear fruits. Matthew 21:43. Matthew 22:15-22 describes how the religious authorities feel embarrassed, but they swiftly devise a new strategy to deal with the situation. Once they have praised Jesus for his honesty, they proceed to question him about the payment of taxes to Caesar. During his examination of a denarius, Jesus observes the image of Tiberius Caesar as well as the inscription that reads, "Son of the Divine," which is met with outrage. Jesus expresses his astonishment publicly over the manner in which they can rationalize the imposition of taxes on a foreign occupier who professes to be the son of a deity. However, he is aware that paying taxes also means funding roads and other services. He acknowledges this fact. Furthermore, Regardless of what is inscribed on coins, the globe should be considered God's property. At the end of his discourse, he challenges them to give Caesar the things that Caesar has and to give God the things that God owns. This response plainly agitates Judas, as well as some of the other people in the crowd who start chanting against him. As Jesus picked up where he left off with the parable of the talents, he was once again interrupted by Shmuel, who questioned him about the greatest commandment, Matthew 22:34-40. Jesus respects the authority of the instructors, but he proceeds to pronounce miseries upon them and laments the impending fall of Jerusalem, Matthew 23. This occurs when Shula asks Jesus why the Pharisees require so much more than what they already have. As he is about to go, he maintains that he has finished teaching and that they will not see him again until they declare, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Matthew 23:39. Peter makes a comment about the beauty of the temple when he sees Jesus taking in its splendor for the very last time. However, Jesus then issues a warning that the temple will be destroyed in the near future. Matthew 24:1-2. As they proceed into the city, the other disciples begin to question whether or not Jesus truly meant what he said about being finished preaching. However, John is adamant that Jesus did in fact mean what he said. Peter sends them back to their homes, but he also goes with James, John, and Andrew to inquire further about the words that Jesus has spoken. They come upon Jesus sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking out over Jerusalem, and they inquire about the signs that they should seek for in order to anticipate the arrival of the kingdom. In response, Jesus makes a lengthy prophecy regarding the upcoming difficulties, including the tribulation and persecution of his followers, as well as the dissemination of the gospel of the kingdom to all countries before the end of the world, Matthew 24:3-14. Jesus tells them that the only person who knows the day or the hour is the Father, and he stresses the importance of remaining vigilant, Matthew 24:36. Therefore, in order for Jesus to have some time to himself, he sends the 4 people back to Jerusalem, since it is too much for them to handle. While he is sitting there, he is saddened by the fact that Jerusalem is unaware of the things that were created for peace. Luke 19:41-42. He also hears music playing in the background. It is a young man who is playing the harp and singing Psalm 5 that he comes across. He comes to the realization that it is a vision of David, but the vision abruptly comes to an end, and Jesus is once again alone himself. In the 3rd episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, Kophni. In the aftermath of the cleansing of the temple, Kophni comes across a man whose lambs were released by Jesus. He begins questioning the guy in order to determine the amount of money that he lost as a result of the disruption that occurred in the temple. The man is aware that Jesus does not have a lot of money, which makes him an unsuitable target for a lawsuit. However, Kophni provides a hint that there is another technique that they can use to exact revenge on him. Later on, as Jesus is responding to the issue about paying taxes to Caesar, Kophni is the one who starts the loud cries that condemn Jesus as a fake Messiah for supporting Rome. A review of the 3rd episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. The 3rd episode deals with some content that is somewhat difficult, yet it does a lot of things that are very well written. Regarding the performances, Jonathan Rumi's acting was absolutely necessary for the success of this episode. He spent a significant portion of his time speaking, whether it was to other people, to the disciples, or to other people. My opinion is that he performed an excellent job for his part. As for Shan Sharma, I thought he did an excellent job portraying Shmuel. In general, I believe that the program does a wonderful job of establishing the tension that exists between Jesus and the religious authorities from the beginning of the show. I really admire how the religious leaders are having a hard time figuring out how to react on the spot, which is a very believable challenge in such a tense and heavily observed situation. Enacted tale. I found the concept of the disciples playing out the tale to be really interesting. Not only did this assist make the teaching more visually attractive, but it also helped emphasize a facet of the parables that is frequently misinterpreted. Jesus arranged his parables in such a way that those who were deaf or hard of hearing could hear them, and utterly missed the lesson. For the purpose of this recital, I could completely understand how some listeners, such as Shmuel, could be unable to comprehend the significance of Jesus until he made it more clear. Theology. In the third episode, we discuss several biblical passages and beliefs that have been the subject of a great deal of controversy. In general, I believe that it did an excellent job of presenting an understanding of Jesus' acts and teaching in the temple that is compatible with a wide variety of theological systems, while avoiding parts that are more contentious and challenging. Skeptical academics have questioned how Jesus could cause such a commotion in the temple and avoid being taken by either the temple guard or Rome. This is one of the problems that I have encountered when trying to solve biblical problems. I admire the way in which the show addresses this issue by utilizing Atticus's participation. Again, who are you exactly? In spite of the fact that I have done extensive research on The Chosen, I found it difficult to keep track of the identities of the various religious leaders who were involved in the debate and determine their individual reasons for participating. My guess is that viewers who are only casually interested could be even more perplexed and disengaged. Shmuel could have been utilized more, and some of the other figures in which I had less of an investment could have been used less. I am aware that at least a couple of more figures would be required to satisfy what the sources tell us. Of course, if the show had been able to do more with the religious leaders in Jerusalem during earlier seasons, it would have been much simpler to recognize and connect with some of the other individuals. Nonetheless, we are unable to change the past. Conversation talk. In contrast to the action that was featured in the first two episodes, this episode featured a significant amount of conversation. I am curious as to whether or not it would have been prudent to divide the remarks into more action-packed segments. After Jesus began speaking to Matthew, I was thinking that we would get an episode that focused more on Matthew. However, it appears that this is not the case. The fact that we did not receive any additional information brings to mind the fact that we have been receiving very little of Matthew, which is disheartening. What exactly took place with Leander? No trace of Leander can be seen anywhere on the map. Despite the fact that I am aware that he has accomplished what he was supposed to in the source material, I believe that we should have wrapped up his character a little bit more. Season 5, Episode 3 of The Chosen, Key Themes and Concepts. The Authority. The third episode is essentially a fight between two rival authorities, Jesus and the religious establishment of Jerusalem. In the frigid open sequence of the Last Supper, Jesus declares, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to Father except through me." John 14:6. This sequence serves to remind us of the exceptional and unrivaled authority that Jesus possesses. Due to the fact that it identifies Jesus as the supreme authority for life and salvation, this verse is commonly taught to younger Christians. By referring to the supernatural deeds that have followed his teaching, Jesus strengthens the divine authority that he possesses. John 14:10-11. Immediately following his departure, Jesus makes a promise to send the Holy Spirit, who will assist his disciples in remembering and comprehending the authoritative teachings that he imparted. John 14:25-26. Following the frigid opening, we are instantly forced into a confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees and chief priests of the Jewish community. The answer that Jesus gives to Zebediah's query about the authority by which he has cleansed the temple is that it is his own initiative. When Jesus is asked to provide a sign that demonstrates his authority, he challenges the leaders of the religious community to destroy this temple so that he might rebuild it in 3 days. John 2:18-19. Jesus is actually pointing to his death and resurrection as the ultimate indication of his authority, despite the fact that they cause confusion and fail to understand what he is trying to say. According to Johannine theology, the crucifixion is interpreted as a form of enthronement or elevation, which is the process by which the divine monarchy and authority of Jesus are revealed and exercised. For example, from John 12:31, according to John 20:27-29, the resurrection is the final confirmation that Jesus is, in fact, Lord and God. When the Pharisees start to question Jesus, they are trying to either undermine his authority in the eyes of the people, force him into a serious theological error, or force him to challenge Rome. All of these goals are being pursued simultaneously. When they ask him where his authority comes from, he sidesteps their inquiry by first asking them to identify the source of John's authority, which is acknowledged by the people but rejected by the urbane elite, Mark 11:27-33. This allows him to avoid answering their question. In the following passage, he uses the parable of the vineyard to show out how they have disobeyed God, the true master, by abusing their position, and to warn them that they would soon be stripped of their authority. Mark 12:1-12. They answer by pressing him about paying taxes to Caesar, anticipating that he will weaken Roman authority. But Jesus shrewdly maintains God as the one genuine divine authority without attacking the practice of Roman taxation. Mark 12:13-17. Jesus concludes his speech by launching an attack on the authority of the religious instructors, pointing out that they were hypocritical and exulting in their own self-importance. Matthew 23. However, the ultimate purpose of the biblical account is for humanity to be brought out of exile and returned to the house of the Father. The biblical story begins with humans live with God in a garden temple. After sin, the humans are ejected from the garden temple. When Jesus tells his followers that he is going to leave in order to make a room for them in the house of his Father, John 14:1-3, they ought to be overjoyed. However, they are too concerned about the possibility of him leaving to be able to fully understand how amazing this news is. In addition to this, Jesus says that he would send the Holy Spirit to reside within them, John 14:15-17. This is not even the most delightful news that Jesus imparts. It is not only that they will reside in the house of God, but God will also transform them into miniature houses or temples for his presence to reside in. Obviously, Jesus is the genuine and ultimate dwelling place of God's presence. The Father is in him, and he is in the Father. In fact, to see him is to see the Father, John 14:7-10. This is the case because Jesus is the embodiment of God. However, the disciples are able to take part in Christ's status as the dwelling place of God if they unite themselves to him by faith and love that is obedient. John 14:23, emphasis added. Before the arrival of Jesus, the only way for people to get back into the dwelling place of God was to enter the temple in Jerusalem and offer sacrifices there. This was the closest they could get to re-entering God's home place. It was a tremendous duty to be in charge of the temple, which was the earthly dwelling of the Father. On the one hand, the priests were responsible with protecting the holiness of the area by keeping out pollution. On the other side, they also had a responsibility to unleash God's spiritual influence by bringing in Israelites and even Gentiles who wished to encounter God. During the encounter that Jesus has with the chief priests, he accuses them of having their work entirely reversed. He says that they have turned a house of prayer for all the nations into a den of thieves, Mark 11:17. They have brought greed and impurity into the sacred area as a result of their arrangement with the money changers and animal vendors. At the same time, they have prevented Gentiles who are interested in experiencing the spiritual impact of God from entering the holy place that they have created. According to Simon Z., the fury that Jesus is experiencing is a manifestation of the biblical verse that states, "Zeal for your house will consume me." John 2:17, Psalm 69:9. In the first episode, Jesus had a vision in which he saw that the temple in Jerusalem had grown so polluted that God would eventually permit it to be destroyed by the Roman forces. However, God is not going to leave his people without access to his house. In fact, he has already sent his true dwelling place, which is Jesus, as well as a temple that will be destroyed, but will be rebuilt in 3 days. John 2:18-21. In Matthew 21:33-44, Jesus gives a warning to the tenants who reign over his Father's home, who are known as the chief priests. He tells them that their banishment is just around the corner, and that the stone that they have rejected, which is Jesus, will soon become the cornerstone of a greater temple, which is the church. The decision that Jesus made to stop offering sacrifices in the old temple is both an indication that the temple has become impure and a foreshadowing of the way in which the church will eventually take over its function. The disciples are not able to keep track of everything that Jesus is discussing with them, and as a result, Jesus specifically tells them that the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed. The disciples Peter, James, and John are unable to conceive of a world in which God does not have a residence on earth. Hence, they believe that Jesus is attempting to convey to them that the end of the world is drawing nigh. Matthew 24, 1-2. They are taken aback by the fact that this is not precisely what Jesus is conveying to them. There are a great number of things that need to take place before the end of the world and God's arrival on earth. On the other hand, this does not imply that God does not even have a residence on earth, in the same way that his stone house in Jerusalem was intended to distribute his holiness and spiritual influence to all the nations. The church will be God's mobile house, spreading his holiness and spiritual influence across the entire world. Having a sense of peace is one of the most fundamental goals that we as humans have. It is reasonable to believe that we can achieve peace by resolving conflicts and avoiding tough situations. The peace that Jesus delivers, on the other hand, is entirely different. In reality, Jesus cautions his disciples about false prophets who provide simple solutions, and instead assures his followers that they will be persecuted and have trouble. Matthew 24, 4-12. Jesus does not promise to keep conflict and hardship out of our life. Jesus does, in fact, offer peace during the Last Supper. This peace is derived from the reassuring presence of his Spirit, John 14:18-26, as well as from the understanding that Jesus knows the end from the beginning and is now reigning in heaven with his Father, John 14:27-29. The majority of the episode is spent with Jesus upsetting the illusory peace that Jerusalem and his disciples have been experiencing. Despite the fact that he has promised peace during the cold open, he has been granted the opportunity to explain himself, despite the fact that he has just caused chaos in the temple. Jesus does not make an effort to bring the temperature down. Rather, he raises the temperature by asserting his authority over the temple, putting an end to the system of sacrifices, and questioning the legitimacy of the chief priests. The disciples' internal tranquility is also disrupted as a result of Jesus' violent assault on the sacrificial system. They are unable to make sense of the apparent shift in their teacher in order to understand what is going on. As Matthew explains to Jesus, there is a sense that his actions are not merely surprising, but really a genuine shock. On the other hand, it appears that this is one of the objectives that Jesus has. Jerusalem is at peace with the corruption that existed within the temple, and the disciples have reached a state of peace with their limited comprehension of the task that Jesus was sent to accomplish. It will not be possible to achieve genuine peace until Jerusalem and the disciples have been shaken out of their complacency and their erroneous sense of calm. It goes without saying that nobody anticipated the Messiah to be completely at peace. In point of fact, the majority of devout Jews held the belief that the Messiah would come to wage war against Rome. As a result, the religious leaders attempted to provoke Jesus into doing so through hyperbole by asking him to comment on Roman taxes. Matthew 22:15-22. In a way, Jesus is being challenged to choose between conflict with Rome, which would imply that he would reject the tax, and disagreement with the people, which would imply that he would legitimize it. In order to oppose both of these points of view, Jesus opts for a third approach, which involves destroying the theology and authority of the Roman emperors while also legitimizing taxation. Jesus' statements provoke the ire of a significant number of individuals in the audience, despite the fact that some of the people are impressed by his rhetorical jujitsu. Once more, rather than making an effort to bring the temperature down, Jesus raises the stakes by launching a verbal assault on the credibility of the religious establishment. Matthew 23. He acknowledges that they do not possess the moral fortitude that is necessary to guide Jerusalem away from the path of war and destruction. In fact, the only hope for the city is for them to be startled out of their complacency over the situation. In the meantime, Jesus encourages his disciples to persevere and reject the false peace that is given by false messiahs, even if it means that they will be reviled and put to death. Matthew 24, 9-13. What were your thoughts on the third episode of the 5th season of The Chosen? Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts, questions, and hypotheses in the comments section below. Episode 3 of the 2nd season of The Chosen provides us with a glimpse into the day-to-day activities of a disciple of Jesus. Matthew 4:24 is the name of this episode, which is a reference to one of the many instances in the Gospels where dozens of healings are summed in a single line.